So the Trump administration has fast-tracked the permitting process to allow for mining in the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest. What should we be thinking about when we think about this story and the potential economic impact, environmental impact, and social impact? Everything. Well, for that, this hour on The Lee Rayburn Show, we're joined by the author of the new book, just out, The Vanishing Earth, Dispatches from the Frontiers of Extraction. And if you've got a question about mining globally, and mining in many different respects, not just oil and not just metals, as the proposal is for the Chequamegon-Nicolet Forest, but also for sand and water, and for that matter, our own mind. You can join the conversation at 1-800-642-1234, 1-800-642-1234. You can send an email to talk@wpr.org. James Crawford is an acclaimed historian, publisher, and broadcaster. His book, Fallen Glory, was selected as a Sunday Times must-read and a Book of the Year by the New Statesman and The Independent. The Edge of the Plain, How Borders Make and Break Our World, earned rave reviews in the New York Review of Books and the Washington Post, and was also featured on CNN's Amanpour. He lives in Edinburgh and joins us today with his new book out now, The Vanishing Earth, Dispatches from the Frontiers of Extraction. And James, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Lee. Thanks for having me.
Let's start with a little bit of your family history and why mining is something that is deeply rooted in your story.
Yeah, so I come from a long family of engineers. My great-great-grandfather was a fisherman who left Scotland actually to emigrate to Canada and then into America. And he crossed the border from Canada into Detroit at the age of 16. And as he crossed the border, he's asked his occupation, and he put on the immigration form he was an engineer. Now, he wasn't an engineer at that point, but he used it as a way to get a job. And the job he got in Detroit was on the assembly line of the Model T Ford. So that started this kind of engineering dynasty, if you like. So my grandfather was an engineer, my father was an engineer, my brother was an engineer, and my father went through lots of different stages of working in extraction. He started off as an apprentice for the British Coal Board, working in coal mining. He then did an engineering degree and went to do copper extraction in Zambia. And then in the 1970s, when oil was found in the North Sea off the coast of Scotland, he moved to take on the job of oil extraction, did that for the next 30 years. And my brothers followed in his footsteps. I am the black sheep in that I'm a writer. I've taken a completely different approach. So in many ways, this book is partly about a reckoning with that and I guess with the legacy of my father's work and this long history of engineering in my family.
And James, the Vanishing Earth takes us around the world, but you start right here in the United States with a phosphorus mine in Florida. And when you visit these places, you fly over them, you drive through them, you talk to the people impacted by them. This phosphorus mine in Florida, could you paint the picture of it for us from the sky and as you look around?
Well, I'll paint it from the ground, first of all, because the interesting thing is it's very hard to see from the ground, which is one of the reasons that I had to get up on an airplane, because Florida is so flat. You know, from this sort of central area, which is known as Bone Valley, where most of the phosphorus mining happens, to the coast by Tampa, there's only about 180 feet in terms of, elevation from the sea to this central plain. So when you're driving around, you just see these kind of high berms, some of which are grass covered, some of which aren't, and they're all behind fencing, so it's very hard to get a good look at them. Then you go up in an airplane, and I arranged with a pilot to take me up from a sort of agricultural farming airport where a lot of crop dusters would take off from, and fly me over the mine sites. And once you do that, you get this sense of the incredible scale of earth that is being removed to access the phosphate. And this is phosphate that is used for fertilizer production. The world's biggest fertilizer producer, Mosaic, operates out of Bone Valley in central Florida. So you're gouging up, almost as I describe it, it's almost like a series of giant rib cages in the landscape, a lot of which are filled with wastewater, huge dragline excavators, on a scale that you see gigantic sort of, 10-ton dump trucks beside them that look like toy cars when you're flying over it. And so that's one aspect. And the second aspect, the one that's really staggering, are the mountains of waste which are left behind, because there's nothing to do with the waste that comes from phosphate production and extraction. It creates this thing called phosphogypsum, which is radioactive. It's highly toxic. It's full of chemicals. So you have these gigantic mountains, and there's about 25 of them in the central Florida plain, amounting for 1 billion tons of waste. And the Environmental Protection Agency, when it was originally set up in the United States in the 1970s, didn't come up with a designation for what to do with this phosphogypsum waste, and they still haven't. So what happens is they just keep piling up the waste into these mountains. And with Central Florida being so flat, these have become major landscape features. And when you're up in a plane, it's like flying over the pyramids. You know, they're bigger than the pyramids. You know, they're like pyramids, but they're like sort of mesa-like structures. A lot of them very kind of grey and raw, and some of them are in rural areas, but some of them are close by to the city of Tampa. And you know, there's one that I flew over that entirely overlooks a high school. You know, a high school football pitch. So there's, you know, you get this sense of something that's both immense in the landscape, but also kind of hidden. And there's another hidden aspect, that actually a lot of these gigantic mountains of waste are starting to disintegrate, and sinkholes are appearing in them from the wastewater, and that's making its way into the water table in Central Florida, and it's making its way into the rivers, and it's resulting in a lot of die-off within the rivers themselves.
Is that why one of the people that you spoke to, James, referred to this area as, and it sounds so interesting, pollution's magic porridge pot?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I don't know if people know the story. There's a story I know in Scotland. It's obviously porridge related, but it's an old fairy story about a porridge pot that someone sets cooking, and they don't think about the consequences. So it never stops cooking, and it ends up growing so large that it you know, drowns the town where the porridge pot was set cooking. And that's the thing with these. Even when you try and say empty the wastewater, what happens is it fills up with rainwater. And of course, you know, you can get, you know, significant amounts of rain in Florida. And the moment the rain lands in these phosphogypsum stacks, it obviously takes on some of the qualities of the radioactive material, the metals, so the water then becomes toxic again. So it's again, how do you deal with that? And the only way you can deal with it is, you know, well, one of the ways they've been dealing with it is pumping it, you know, 1,000 feet down into the aquifer and hoping it doesn't make its way into the water supply, or taking it out and dumping it in the Gulf of Mexico, again, which is resulting in serious impacts on the water quality in the Gulf of Mexico, and significant dead zones that are developing where no life can exist. So you have this pollution problem where you just keep creating it, and you've nowhere to put it. And the longer you do that, the more significant the impacts become.
Vern Called couldn't stay with us. He says the environmental impact of lithium mining is enormous, and it's destroying the lives of farmers and poor people in South America, which is something you have learned firsthand, James, in your book, The Vanishing Earth. You fly over Chile's Atacama Desert, you look at the lithium mines there, and you're left with this question about not just the mining and the soil and the metals, but also the water and what becomes of the water, and whether or not is the question that is brine water or not.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the brine that the lithium is in is not exactly water, but it is part of an ecosystem. And I think that, you know, this is the issue, and things live within that lithium brine. So I mean, it's such an interesting and beautiful landscape. This is the Salar de Atacama, the salt flats on the edge of the Atacama Desert, right below the spine of the Andean mountain range. And I guess if you imagine a giant bathtub, and what happens is that whatever precipitation in this part of the world that there is, and there's a lot of snow cover on the top of the Andean rim, which is a volcanic rim. It's also a lot of active volcanoes. And as that snow melts, it runs down into this bathtub, and then this relentless sun evaporates it. And what you get is a huge, really huge accumulation of salt crystals. And within those salt crystals is this kind of all these tiny thread veins of brine. And lithium mining works by pumping that brine to the surface into a series of gigantic pools, each about the size of 50 football pitches. And then over the course of 16 months, the brine in the pools evaporates and it changes its chemical composition. At the end, you get it starts off bright blue, and at the end, the final pool will be this almost olive green. And that's the lithium that gets taken away for processing, that makes its way into the batteries of electric vehicles, the battery of your laptop, your mobile phone. And the brine itself, the lithium miners that I talked to, they're saying they're having very limited impact on this ecosystem, but they are using fresh water to flush the pipes that pump out the brine. And you're using fresh water in a place that's 40 years into a mega drought, where there's a very, very fragile ecosystem. There's a number of villages and indigenous people who live on the rim of the Salar de Atacama. And, they are experiencing significant changes to that ecosystem. There's a lot of argument whether that's being caused by the lithium mining, whether it's already being caused by copper mining, because this is one of the world's largest sites of copper mining as well. But they're seeing die-off in their fragile ecosystems. And to go there and to see each village in the Salar de Atacama that's on the rim below these series of volcanoes is like a thread of green in a landscape that otherwise looks like the surface of Mars. So you get a sense of how fragile this all is. But then there's this incredible interconnection between the people and the lithium itself. As one of the villagers who works with and for one of the lithium extraction companies put it to me, lithium is the state for us. Wow. They don't trust the government, but the lithium has given them things. The lithium has given them solar plants rather than diesel generators. They've entered into profit-sharing deals with the lithium miners, which in some respects might help sustain their villages in the short term, but will it in the long term if all of the water is taken away by the process of mining? And I think that's the concern. There might be short-term gain for significant long-term loss.
James Crawford, our guest, his new book, The Vanishing Earth, Dispatches from the Frontiers of Extraction. And if you'd like to join our conversation with your questions or your stories about mining, you're welcome at 1-800-642-1234. That's 800-642-1234. Or send us an email to talk@wpr.org. And James, I think of lithium as part of the green energy solution. Lithium batteries replacing our gas-powered cars, lithium in our cell phones that keep us all connected, that this is a necessity, right? But at the same time, when you describe the mines, it also becomes, as one person in Chile put it, pollution is part of our folklore, our tradition.
Yeah, I think it's a perfect example of something I talk about a lot in the book, which is a sacrifice zone or a sacrifice landscape. And this is, it's a really interesting term. This sacrifice zone was actually invented by the American government in the 1970s during the energy crisis, when they were looking at strip mining in the Midwest, and the fact that they were going to essentially take over large parts of sort of ranch land or farming land and strip mine it for coal, for energy, because of this energy crisis, the oil crisis. And that might be very difficult to ever return those landscapes to their former agricultural uses, unless you designated them national sacrifice zones, in which case, after you'd used up, destroyed the landscape, got out the coal, you could say it's a national sacrifice zone, and then it would be rehabilitated as a sacrifice zone. It's a very strange, bureaucratic nicety. Basically, it means you've destroyed a landscape, but you've destroyed it in the service of something bigger. And I guess the pressure that's put on the people in Chile is that this is one of the largest sites of lithium extraction in the world. If you take in the neighboring territories of Bolivia and Argentina, something like a third of all the Earth's currently accessible lithium is in these places, and they are being told that this landscape is absolutely necessary for the green transition, and that the removal of this lithium is necessary for the green transition. And in many ways, that is true. But what's the cost of that? And I suppose the book doesn't give any easy answers about this, but it does lay bare the nature and extent of the problem. Because one of the people I talked to in Chile who has relatives in America, and she was over at the time of the Super Bowl, and at the halftime adverts there was an advert for large electric SUVs, and the gist of the advert was like, it's electric now, it can be as big as you want. But obviously, that's still that comes from this landscape in Chile. The more lithium you use, the more you're extracting, the more damage to that landscape. So the idea that we should live within our means with this transition to electric, or this other idea, it's electric now, it can be gigantic, that's the wrong direction, because it's that kind of sense of everything can always be bigger. And the worry that we have moving forward is that actually that sense of infinite growth may not be possible in a finite planet, and we may have to reckon with that.
Let's go to Jack in Madison next. Jack, hi.
Hey, Lee. A couple of thoughts. And first of all, noticing that your guest is from Scotland, I appreciated the Scottish cultural callback with the overflowing porridge analogy. And other than that, as a kid, I remember visiting Pendarvis historical site outside of Mineral Point, Wisconsin, where a lot of Cornish people went to become miners and get in on the lead mining trade at the time. And it was just interesting learning about how, I think I was 8 when I went there, that kids who were about my age would first go down to the mines and learn how to dig for lead, and then, build up that skill set over time. But one of the things that I just got thinking about was how aware people were of the innate dangers of mining, especially, with a child workforce in that day and age. And to kind of bring it up to the present, like, is there a more sustainable way of conducting mining in general, one that obviously won't have as, catastrophic ecological repercussions, and that is better for human health in the long run?
Jack, it's a great question, and I don't think there's anybody better to ask who has been around the world and looked for answers to this. And you really don't talk about how directly dangerous mining is to the actual miners who do it that much. You're looking at the aftermath and its impact around the communities that largely are created because of this mining, James Crawford. But did you find a way where mining can be done in an environmentally stable way?
I mean, one of the things I'd say is that one of the reasons my father didn't become a miner was partly because of the dangers of mining, and really interestingly, if you look into the history of mining in Scotland, there was something called coal bonding, which was the workers were bonded to the seams of coal they worked, and if they wanted to try and go, if they were in Scotland and they wanted to go and mine in Cornwall, they would be brought back. It was a form of slavery. And so one of the things that I think for my father, who came from a working class background, moving into oil, was oil actually allowed social mobility in a way that coal mining never did. Nonetheless, and I'm going to come on to answer the question about sustainability in a second, but this is an important point. One of the things I want to emphasize is I'm immensely proud of what my father did, and he worked on oil infrastructure, rig construction, rig design in the North Sea, and this was incredibly pioneering stuff. It was, some have said it was equivalent to putting men on the moon. The hostile nature of the environment that oil men were working in. So there's something really quite remarkable about that. And I don't agree with the demonization of anyone who works in these extractive industries, because I've talked to a lot of them. I come from a family of them, and a lot of them are just trying to do it to get by, to put food on their family's table. On the question of sustainable extraction, this is like the holy grail. And a lot, particularly with lithium, actually, it was, there was a sort of senior executive in the lithium mining company that I was talking to who was trying to paint this picture for me that what they're doing in the Atacama Desert is more like farming than extraction. It's using solar power, it's low impact. They're trying to develop a technology called direct lithium extraction, which basically removes the lithium as you pump the water. It's still not proven at any scale. But even then, it is this thing that's a little bit like alchemy. It's like trying to turn base metal into gold. There are a number of other people that I talked to who basically said there is no such thing as sustainable extraction. You cannot do it. You have to find the least damaging way of doing it. And I think one of the key things is you have to bake in the cost. And what has often happened with extraction is the companies that are pioneering it, that are doing it, that are making profits from it, are not paying the knock-on cost. And the knock-on cost is happening increasingly across the entire world now. And of course, one of the major knock-on costs from the burning of fossil fuels is the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And again, we're all feeling that. But the companies that have benefited from it are not paying the cost of it at all. And, I know you've had wildfire smoke in Wisconsin very recently, in Madison, so that is starting to bite more and more. That sense of this is happening somewhere else. We are benefiting. It's happening somewhere else, somewhere I can't see. It's happening in the desert in Chile. It's happening in rural central Florida. I can't really see the effects. Increasingly, we are all seeing the effects. You can't turn away. And I think that's one of the critical things that I want to look at in the book. And I think we can try and move towards ideas of how do we do this more sustainably, because we can't switch off extraction. We can't stop it. The world would stop. Right. The civilization we've built would stop if we did that. But the way we're doing it is just not sustainable. I mean, that's the key message of the book. None of this is sustainable, and we are seeing all the cracks right now on a global.
James, I'm sorry, I got a couple of minutes before the break, but just to the idea of environmentally sustainable way to mine, you did go look for this, and probably the closest you got was looking at the timber industry in Oslo, Norway.
Yeah, that's right. I went to stay in the tallest all timber building in the world, which is 18 stories high. It's not entirely all timber, but it's about sort of 70%. It has some concrete and some steel in it, largely just to weigh it down, because if you just build with wood, the top floor is a little bit like a crow's nest on a ship, might start to move in the wind. Not that there would be any structural problem, but people staying on the upper floors might get seasick, apparently. But if you build with timber, you sequester the carbon, and then you replant the trees. And there is vast potential for scale up in certain parts of the world, and particularly in Scandinavia, to build more with timber. And one of the things they rigorously do is test its fire safety, to the extent that one of Norway's main insurance company takes offices on the 5th or 6th floor of this all timber building. So that's, once you've got the endorsement from insurance, you're okay, because they're the hardest people to please. So that's a sustainable way of extracting timber, harvesting it, replanting it, rather than the process of constructing the built environment that we know, which is predominantly concrete and steel, which is an incredibly large emitter. In fact, the built environment is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases on the planet.
And you also went to the western shores of Greenland to look at the sand mines. As the glaciers recede, there seems to be more sand than ever, but we've used more sand than ever in everything that we've built. And I mean from the cement to the aggregates, the bricks, the asphalt, you name it. Sand is being used everywhere, but at the same time, as you point out in the book, sand is running out. James Crawford, our guest, author of the brand new book, The Vanishing Earth, Dispatches from the Frontiers of Extraction, and we're traveling the world with him and covering some of his experiences and what he saw, who he talked to, and what he learned. You can join our conversation at 1-800-642-1234. That's 800-642-1234. What can we learn from him? You can also send us an email to talk@wpr.org. I'm Lee Rayburn, and you are listening to WPR News. So there is copper to be found under the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest. Should we mine for it? There has been a fast track in the permitting process to allow it. Our guest this hour is James Crawford. He has traveled the world for his new book, The Vanishing Earth, Dispatches from the Frontiers of Extraction. And you're welcome to our conversation this hour about mining at 1-800-642-1234. That's 800-642-1234, or email talk@wpr.org. Let's go to Luis in Dodgeville next. Luis, hi.
Hi, I have a question for your guest. Just wondering, I guess, what you've learned. Can you speculate about the future in when, like, if we tap out everything, tap out our resources, what's left? Have we just not discovered it yet? And I'm a little fuzzy on my British history, but I think during the Industrial Revolution, at first it was sourced by timber, and then all the timber got tapped out, and then that's when it switched to coal. And so it seems like humanity has kind of always gone to the brink and then found something new. So just wondering your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Luis. So what happens if we run out of natural resources, and what about this progression of moving through resources as we run through them, James?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we often find, as your caller said, is that, when you're pushed to the brink, we discover something new. And that is testament to the ingenuity of humanity. It may also be luck, and there may be a point where we don't find something new, and who wants to be around when that happens? And that's obviously one of the risks. I mean, I think one of the interesting things that your caller sort of mentioned there, and to pick up on, and it was something that I discovered in the course of writing this book that kind of astonished me, actually towards the end of writing it, something I came across, is that last year we burnt more timber, more coal, and more oil than ever before in human history. Now, we think of a transition. We think of, well, we used to burn wood, and then coal came along, and then we burnt that, and then we moved on to oil, and now we're trying to develop solar, and we're trying to develop wind. But actually, we're just using more and more of everything. And I think that's one of the really big concerns here, is that this talk of transition isn't transition, it's actually just accumulation. And there's something called Jevons paradox, which goes back actually to the British Industrial Revolution and a concern that the coal might run out. And this researcher, Stanley Jevons, is looking into it. And he's saying, well, at what point are we going to run out of coal? And what would happen if we made the steam turbines more efficient so you could get the same energy out of less steam? And the turbines become more efficient. So then what happens? Do you use less coal in these turbines? Actually, no, you use more coal to do more with the more efficient turbines. And this is Jevons' paradox, that the more energy you have access to, the more you use. And this is the problem that, I mean, it's one of the things, that doesn't even feature really in the book, is that I wanted to have a whole chapter about nuclear fusion, this idea of fusion technology. And in the end, I made a trip to a sort of prototype fusion plant in Oxford in England, where for a brief time they managed to get the fusion working, and it was so hot. It was about 10 times hotter than our sun. It was the hottest point in the universe for half a millisecond before the plasma kind of broke apart. But the problem is, if you have access to that clean energy, does that solve the problem that we have, or does it create a new problem? Because there's still issues around, population, land, resources, capital, how big we build, where we build, all these sorts of things. So universal clean energy may not be the solution that we actually think it is. And maybe we have to think differently about how we live on the planet, which comes back to that question about sustainability. And how do you live sustainably on Earth? It's one of the things that I begin the book with, and it's a statistic that just blew me away, is that a threshold was crossed in 2020 where the weight of everything that humanity has built came to exceed the weight of all living things on Earth.
What? Could you say that again, please, James? Let me wrap my head around
So in 2020, the weight of everything that we have built and created and made came to exceed the weight of all living things on Earth. So that's plants, animals, biomass, trees, everything. And then you think, okay, that must have been a steady accumulation across all of human civilization since the last ice age. It's been building, it's been building, it's been building, and suddenly cross that threshold. That's not the case. At the start of the 20th century, the weight of everything we had made only accounted for 3% of the weight of all living things. The acceleration has happened after the Second World War. It's happened in the last 70 years. So we have put our foot to the pedal in a way like we never have before. And we have taken more out of the earth in the last 50 years than in all the rest of human history combined.
And when you talk about putting the foot on the pedal, I can't help but think of the debate over data centers and their demand for water and electricity, and some speculation from our, I think it's a public service commission here that does our utilities in Wisconsin, that our demand for electricity could rise by as much as 40% in the next 6 years in Wisconsin.
Yeah, I mean, I think data centers is such an interesting thing to talk about. And, I touched on it briefly in the book, but I'm very aware of what's going on in America and how bipartisan the resistance to data centers is. It's like nobody wants it in their backyard. And America has more than any other country in the world. And I think when I was writing the book, and it'll be higher than this, I think it was something in the region of 5 to 7% of all of the electricity use in the US was for data centers. But that was statistics dating to about 2023, 24. So, 2 years later, it's going to be more significant. You're talking about building some of the biggest data centers on Earth, all of which is both fueling the cloud and fueling AI development. And it's a perfect example, actually, of what I was talking about earlier, of this kind of sacrifice zone. Because those towns that are going to have to be near the data centers in some way are being sacrificed for this greater glory, particularly of frontier AI companies, and the major tech companies based out of Silicon Valley, and people don't want them. They don't want them near them. They don't want to be a part of it. And of course, they are drawing on real world resources. They're drawing on critical minerals, and they're drawing on significant amounts of water. At a time when there's drought across various parts of the world and various parts of the US. So this is where we start to collide against the limits, and it's a really interesting, very current example of why that's a problem.
Luis, thank you so much for the call. Let's go to Perry in Oconto next. Hi, Perry.
Yes, as a public landowner, I'm seeing similarities between the Squamican National Forest and permitting the use of copper mines there, and also how it affected the copper mine in the Boundary Waters, which is sold off to a Chilean company, and we can't even process the copper here. We got to ship it to China for processing. And how has the guest seen, other than voting, make sure we get out and vote for the people that serve us, but how has he seen other countries push back against this destruction of the environment?
Recourse, James.
Yeah, I mean, there's a really interesting case study in Ecuador. Ecuador, which its main product throughout most of its history was banana exports, until Texaco arrived and started drilling the Amazon. And Texaco drilled the Amazon in a way that it wouldn't have been allowed to drill the Amazon, wouldn't have allowed to have drilled in America. There's something called oil field brine, which when it's brought to the surface when you drill oil, you have to put back underground. But because there was no environmental regulation in Ecuador, they didn't do that. And they created what was described as a lawyer in a case, put it in a case against Texaco as a rainforest Chernobyl. And that's throughout the 1980s. You have extensive amounts of drilling. And very recently, in 2023, there was a referendum in Ecuador. The whole country voted on whether or not to drill for oil in a protected part of the Amazon National Park in that country. And I think it was 60% of the country voted no, not to drill there. And the Constitution of Ecuador has established what are known as rights of nature, so that rivers and forests, mountains, landscapes have their own rights. And I know this is something that is developing in other countries in the world, and there are examples of it in the US itself and in Canada. So that's one recourse, is that the law is in many ways ahead of the politics. And there's a really fascinating and interesting concept. And I have a background in legal history because I studied law at university before I became a writer. And there's something called the public trust. And the public trust dates back to the Roman Emperor Justinian. And it's a very simple thing, is that the government shouldn't be allowed to destroy the water, the air, and the soil. And it's baked into the US Constitution. You know, the people who wrote your Constitution were farmers. They understood that very well. And we haven't really been enforcing those rights until now. And climate change and the impacts of extensive mining bring them into sharp focus. So I think that's one recourse, that legal cases are happening all over America right now, which are dealing with his concept of public trust.
Perry, thank you for the call. We'll go to Ernest in Hayward next. Hi, Ernest.
Hi. You know, I've always thought that our tax system is backwards. We prefer taxing income rather than resource depletion and pollution. Al Gore once suggested replacing the payroll tax with a carbon tax. Henry George, in his book Progress and Poverty, went even further when he suggested a single tax on land and natural resources. You know, right now, a natural limitation on data centers is the cost of energy and water, and that is without a carbon tax and without a tax on water withdrawals from high-capacity wells and from the Great Lakes.
Ernest, thank you for the comment. And if we were to tax these companies, would that be passed along to us? Is that an avenue to explore to help protect and sustain our mining and extraction, James?
I think building in the real costs is one initial way of doing it. That if you're going to embark on a new copper mine, what is the environmental cost of that? What is the true environmental cost of that? And is the mining company prepared to pay it? And I think that's a fundamental question that has to be asked of all extraction. And the reality has never really been asked before. The extractors haven't had to pay. They go in, they get the high profit materials, and then they get out. Maybe they sell it on to someone else who's prepared to eke out some profit from the lower grade material, and then they move on again. And I think the absolute perfect example of that is Butte, Montana. I don't know if you want to talk about that now, Lee, but I think that's such a fascinating story to get into about how this could work going forward.
Well, Butte, Montana would be where the Copper Kings were, right? And this is and where a Superfund site can be found today.
Yeah, it's the largest environmental cleanup site in America. For those who don't know, Butte, it was known as the richest hill on earth. Something like a third of all the copper in America came from there at the start of the 20th century, you know, particularly to electrify the whole nation. Miners from all across the world came. They dug something in the region of 10,000 kilometers of tunnels into this one hill, and the city grew up right on top of the mine. And then you get to the 1950s and copper is not profitable anymore. And the way to eke out what's left of the mine, the choice you have is to make it open cast. So then you demolish the mountain. You make this giant pit in the center of the city. You move entire neighborhoods from the hill down to what's known as the flats, the sort of lower bit of the plain below this copper mountain. Then it becomes so unprofitable that it gets closed. And you've dug so deep below the water table that it fills up with water. And because of the nature of the rocks you've opened up, the water becomes contaminated with heavy metals. And what you have in Butte is a lake that's almost a mile wide, half a mile deep, full of 50 billion gallons of essentially sulfuric acid. Oh. What do you do with that is the question. And it's the question that has been asked of Butte for the past 30 years. And they reached a settlement, I think it was in 2023. And the settlement is incredibly interesting because the copper mine was sold by the Anaconda Copper Mining Company, which was owned variously by both the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers. It was sold on to an oil company that had hit it big in the 1980s, who didn't know how to mine. Price of copper went through the floor. That oil company was actually bought over by one of the largest oil companies in the world, BP. So all of the liability for this Superfund site, this environmental cleanup site, has fallen on BP. And they've essentially, as part of the settlement, got a blank check to monitor and maintain the water and soil of Butte in perpetuity, forever. Because you have to pump and treat the water in the pit, which is known as the Berkeley pit, forever, because there's no way of stopping it filling up. And you have to monitor the surrounding soil because there's so much copper smelted in Butte on site that people's attics are full of asbestos dust. As one person in Butte said to me, they didn't realize that soil wasn't yellow until they left Butte, and they would ride their BMXs in this kind of yellow moonscape where bones would turn, if like a bird died, its bones would turn blue because of the chemical reaction to the calcium and the copper in the soil. So you could abandon this city, but the people aren't abandoning it. They're turning to repair, and they accept that the repair that has to happen in Butte has to happen forever. There is no alternative. It has to happen forever. The company that is liable for it, not exactly responsible for it, but bought the liability, has to pay for it forever. Now, what does forever look like? That's the question I can't answer. It's a question I pose towards the end of the book. But it's also a way of looking at the whole world, that what we need is that repair mindset for the entire planet. And to look at that in all our different ways, bipartisan, as engineers, people who are activists, people who are writers, people who are miners. We have to look at it in that collective way. And I think Butte's such an interesting model for how that's happening, because the people are not abandoning that city. They're staying and they're trying to change it and make it better, and trying to understand what repair means for them as a way of telling a story they have to tell forever, because they have to hand it on to generation after generation after generation if they're going to stay there. And so there's hope in that, even though the damage is so great.
The quote that I have highlighted here from your book, James Crawford, is, with Butte, and this is what somebody told you, with Butte, it's a remedy, it's not a fix, there is no exit. And that just sort of hung there for me, and I can't stop thinking about it in those terms, and especially when you mention some of the wealthiest corporations and some of the wealthiest people having their hands in what became this Superfund site, being able to extract what they could from this Superfund site, make as much money as they could from it, and then the people of Butte, what they're left with is no exit. Linda in Iowa emailed us. She wants to know how much copper and other metals can be found in our landfills. Per ton, she would think our landfills would be more productive than rock. And same with taking from old mines and extraction of other metals, the potential that we could be mining our landfills, James?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of examples of this, of what are known as urban mines, giant recycling plants that are taking in metals, separating them out, and that circularity, I think, is definitely one of the ways forward. At the moment, is there money in that? And I think that's the concern. Who's developing those businesses? It's a little bit like the example I traveled to Iceland to look at this concept of carbon capture, which is you remove carbon dioxide from the air and you pump it underground in this kind of pressurized water, like a soda stream, and it hardens into rock. And that decreases the parts per million of carbon dioxide in the air, which is causing the global warming that we're experiencing. Unfortunately, that at the time I visited was the largest carbon capture plant on Earth. It's powered by geothermal energy, so it's a renewable power source, but it only removes the equivalent of 700 cars worth of emissions a year. So, I mean, it's the tiniest drop in the largest ocean. They've actually since opened a bigger than that, which is now the biggest carbon capture plant in the world, just next to the first one, which is 10 times larger, but that's 7,000 cars. And it needs to work with renewable energy, otherwise it's part of the problem. but the chief technical officer for the company that developed it, a company called Climeworks, put it to me, cleaning up isn't sexy.
Yeah.
It isn't sexy, it isn't profitable as it stands. And I think that's one of the problems. But we need to clean up. We have to clean up the messes that we are making. And I think that's one example of how we're trying to, but it's at such small scale that whether it's part of a solution or, something tangential, I'm not sure.
We can't make the entire planet a sacrifice zone. That just doesn't make any sense. The point is well taken. But how does that carbon capture plant compare to just plain trees, James?
Planting trees is simpler and easier. And to be fair to the company, Climeworks, that developed this, Swiss company, they're very much, we need to do all these different things, all these different methods of carbon capture. I mean, one other example that came from my time in Greenland was something called glacial rock flour. So as the glaciers move through Greenland and they erode the rock and they leave this kind of sediment, almost like a kind of clay, you can spread that over crops. It's like a natural fertilizer. So it gives nutrients that crops need to grow at the same time as binding and removing carbon from the atmosphere. So that's an example of something. If you did that at scale, that would be another part of a solution. But there's no one silver bullet. And I think that's the main thing. There is no one silver bullet, apart from perhaps thinking differently.
Yeah.
Changing the nature of how we think about our place on the planet, how we think about how our corporations operate, how we think about profit and what we include and don't include, particularly for those who are causing the most damage. I think that factoring that in has got to be a key part of how we move forward.
Karen in Madison called and couldn't stay with us, but she echoes this. She says we need to think of ourselves not as consumers, but as people first, and that we need to think of what we'll pass along to the next generation as a priority.
Yeah, I think it's the notion of stewardship, and I think that's why that story in Butte, which comes at the end of the book, which I didn't necessarily expect I would find what I found, and in a way, I found so much hope in it, so much hope in something that is a sacrifice zone. In some respects, America's largest sacrifice zone, where the damage is both visible and invisible. It's made its way, it's filtered all the way down the sort of tributary river that runs out of Butte, Silver Bow Creek, as it's known, which turns into the Clark Fork River, which is a tributary of the Columbia River. There's a danger there that pollutants from historical copper smelting make their way into that river, but they're fighting against that, and they understand this idea of stewardship and what you have to look after. And if we all collectively understand the concept of stewardship, that's a way of moving forward. But at the moment, corporations don't care. And that's the problem, is that doesn't help shareholder, growth.
But corporations aren't people. They wouldn't care. They have priorities. And if we were to make corporations care, we would have to enforce priorities upon them in a way that you wouldn't have to do with a human being that has things like empathy and a long-term understanding of the next generation.
That's right. And in many ways, that's where the rights of nature movement comes from. Because, you have examples of things that are not people that have rights. Corporations have rights, companies have rights. The argument comes, well, why shouldn't a river have rights? Why shouldn't a river have rights not to be destroyed? Why shouldn't the salt flat in Chile have a say in whether or not it has to sacrifice itself for the good of humanity? I think all of these are really interesting questions.
And James, we'll have to leave it there with more questions, but your book was fascinating. This hour has been wonderful. I want to thank you for sharing it with us, and I want to encourage folks who are interested in more to go get the Vanishing Earth Dispatches from the Frontiers of Extraction. James Crawford, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Lee.
James Crawford is an acclaimed historian, publisher, and broadcaster. Again, his book out now, The Vanishing Earth, Dispatches from the Frontiers of Extraction. Thank you for the calls. Ian, I'm sorry we ran out of time for you. Hopefully another time. I'm Lee Rayburn, and you are listening to WPR News. You know, if it wasn't for mining, Wisconsin never would have been the Badger State. The University of Wisconsin-Madison would have needed a different mascot. I don't know exactly what that might have been. But it's worthwhile then to take some time today to talk about the history of mining in Wisconsin here on the Lee Rayburn Show. And our guest to do that is a senior lecturer emeritus from the Department of History at UW-Platteville. If you have questions about the history of mining in Wisconsin or a story of your own that ties back to the legacy of mining in Wisconsin, you are welcome to join our conversation at 1-800-642-1234. That's 800-642-1234, or you can send an email anytime to talk@wpr.org. Our guest joining us now is Tracey Lee Roberts. And Tracey, welcome back.
Thank you, Lee. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with a little bit of geology, shall we? What was it about the driftless region that made it so rich for mining?
Well, you know, the word driftless really means that we're in an area down here in the lead mine district that is lacking glacial drift. That's the heavy rocks, the soil, you know, the gravel, the sand that glaciers pushed and crushed as they were moving southward. So our area was missed, which means we didn't end up under feet and feet, maybe even a mile of drift material. That means the lead that was percolating up from the, bowels of the earth 360 million years ago was actually closer to the surface because we didn't have the drift on top. It made it easier to find that lead ore.
That makes a lot of sense. Before we get to the European settlers who made this the Badger State, what's this history of Native Americans and mining in the driftless region?
Well, Native Americans were mining here way before white people showed up in the area. We have found, I haven't found, but archaeologists all over the country have found that there is our kind of lead ore all over the country in Native American sites. So, for example, in Hopewell sites in Ohio, we find our type of lead ore there. So there's clearly a lot of trading going on. Lead is often crystallized it's in kind of crystal shapes, and it's often combined with some silver, making it very shiny. So it's a really interesting kind of ore. Which was prized by lots of people.
And then, go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, and then we would have seen... Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that, so we're talking about, very ancient pre-contact Native Americans, and Ho-Chunk people in our state say that they have been here forever, like they've been here since, the last Pleistocene. So, they've been here thousands of years. So they feel that they are the descendants of those miners.
Sure. And I think what fascinates me is how far our lead could be found in native tribes across this country.
Yeah, it's amazing.
So when it comes to the European settlers then, who were they? Who were these incoming lead miners? Where did they come from? And how did they land on these mines as a resource?
Sure. Well, we had this, on this continent, there was this huge rivalry between the French, the British, and the Spanish. And we're talking about way, early 1500s. So you've got 1600s. You're talking about major rivalries between colonial powers. So the French, of course, had gone up into Canada. And, of course, the British were along the eastern seaboard, and the Spanish had come up from the south, and they were inhabiting all kinds of areas around the Mississippi River and into the south. And they weren't holding down the fort real well, but the French certainly were in Canada. And so they started coming down into different areas and making maps. We know about Louis Joliet and Father Jacques Marquette. When they came around this area, and I'm talking about my area of the lead mine district in southwest Wisconsin, in 1672, they made a map called the Map of New Discoveries. And this map clearly shows the word like mine de plume, which means mines of lead. So they were quite aware of this lead. So different French people were starting to explore the area. But it was really when Julien Dubuque showed up from Canada, he established the village of Dubuque, Iowa. But he was working with the Native Americans. He wasn't working against them. He worked with Métis cultures, which were combinations of French and Native American people. And they were mostly Muskogee, Sauk, and Menominee, and some Ho-Chunk. But mostly the Muskogee were working with him. So that was at where Dubuque, Iowa stands today. And that was in the late 1700s. So you can see it's a long progression of people discovering, exploring, and learning about these mines and being excited about it. But Dubuque really being able to make that connection where he made friends with these folks and intermarried with the Muskogee people and therefore made the connections needed to create a lead mining camp there. Mm-hmm.
Tracey, what was the lead mining process like? How did they extract ore? How did they dig? What kind of tools were they using? Did they have furnaces to smelt with?
So we're using like picks and gads at first, and then just basic, simple tools. So they're digging a hole. They're digging down maybe 6 to 8 feet, something safe where you're not having to, build up the walls too much, where you won't have to worry about a cave-in. Seeing if there's any lead ore, and if there is, they're going to follow that on the horizontal. So you're going down vertically, and then you're going to go check if that vein of lead is running, horizontally along a certain at a certain elevation. If they find that lead, they're going to keep digging, and they're going to start propping up the sides. And as more technology comes into the area, they're able to start, getting the water out of mines that are deeper. Mm-hmm. So technology plays a huge role here. In terms of smelting lead ore, Native Americans had smelting, but it was a little more crude and didn't create the product that made for a very malleable lead. It didn't drive off enough of the sulfur molecules and the other things that can be in lead that make it brittle. So it was when the lead furnaces of the 1840s came in, the blast furnace, that really the lead ore was much better quality in that point.
Tracey Lee Roberts, our guest, Senior Lecturer Emeritus from the History Department at UW-Platteville, taking a look at the lead district and the mining history of the Badger State. And if you have a question or a story to share, you can join us at 1-800-642-1234. That's 800-642-1234. Or send an email to talk@wpr.org. You talk about the French explorers making their way down from Canada, but I am certain, Tracey, that there are many nationalities that ended up becoming who we call today as the Badgers and some of the miners in the Driftless region.
Yes, absolutely. So as soon as Americans are hearing about all this lead ore coming out of the area, they're pretty excited about it and start moving toward the area. Well, Native Americans controlled this whole region, so it wasn't like nobody was here.
Right. And
they were adamant that they were going to keep their mines. The mines that Dubuque started with, these Native American groups, once he died in 1810, they weren't going to let go of that. They never gave Dubuque that land. They did a lease with him. Other white people said, no, Dubuque owned the land, so I'm a descendant, or he owes me money, so I get to own the land now. And they're like, no, that's not true, and if you come into our land, we will kill you. So there were lots of skirmishes between 1810 and 1821 to keep out white miners. But finally, actually, it was Southerners who came first before the immigration of folks from Europe. So we're talking about some really powerful Americans, like Colonel Richard M. Johnson became Vice President of the United States not too much later. He was supposedly the killer of Tecumseh at the Battle of Thames. That was, I think, 1813. And so he and his brother showed up in the lead mine district, but they showed up with military troops, U.S. troops, on horseback. So now the Native Americans are like, oh, oops, maybe we don't, maybe we can't hold on to this. And sure enough, he bought a very important major mine that was actually in the Galena, Illinois area for only $300. And the thing produced unbelievable amounts of lead ore. So it was mostly those folks. So, we talk about the Southerners coming up from Southern Illinois, Missouri, Kentucky area. Then we talk about how folks showed up from the East Coast. So we've got these Yankees showing up with a very different view on how things should be done. And then, of course, we have our immigrant population. So maybe you'd be interested in talking about that at this point.
Yeah, because Tracey, the Yankees and the Southerners, I guess I did not know. I always thought of it as sort of an opportunity for immigrants to America who made their way all the way into the heartland, and this is what they found as their best bet to eke out a living, to carve out a little piece for themselves, quite literally when it comes to the caves that they would sleep in. But I didn't know about the Southerners that came up and then claimed the mines and brought, sort of a small army with them, and what kind of resources they must have had to come up here and take this land.
Well, some of them had some resources in terms of knowing how to mine lead ore, because in Missouri there was a big lead mining industry, and it really was bigger than the industry we have in Wisconsin for a while. It's just that their industry was about 50 miles from the Mississippi River, making it hard to transport the finished lead ore, to a way to get it down to St. Louis, down to New Orleans.
Mm-hmm.
So Galena, Illinois, became the port town of the lead mine district of Wisconsin, and the Wisconsin River was as well. And so these are places that are much closer to the Mississippi River, making it cheaper and easier to move really heavy ore over land. But these folks, these Yankees and Southerners, had names for each other. I mean, even the Southerners, like they called the Southern Illinois folks suckers, because like the sucker fish, right? They would show up in the summer and they'd leave in the winter. They're only there for a couple months of the year. And they do a little mining, and then they go back to their farm and their homes, south. So they all had names. And the badger name, you seem interested in that, and I want to just talk about that for a minute,
Sure.
if I could. I did a big study on a thing called badger huts, and I had that article published in the Illinois Journal called Illinois Heritage Magazine, and that was a publication of Illinois State Historical Society. And badger huts are actually not just caves, but they're actually built from limestone. They still are on the landscape. So I went around this whole region, and I found as many badger huts as I could. I found 12 still standing.
Huh.
And the documentary evidence is quite clear that they were building these huts into hillocks, or creating kind of a hillock by mounding up dirt and then building down and into to make a cavity that they would have an arched building, and this building would be about 12 feet deep and about 8 feet wide and about 7 feet high at the apex of the building. And these are lovely, lovely little buildings. And they are all over our region, from Galena into Lafayette County, Grant County. I have found a number of these. And so I found this fascinating because I first read about it in the historic documentation about the area, that there were these buildings. I'm like, well, are they still out there?
Yeah.
Well, yes, they are. They still are out there. So that's kind of fun. And that's how we got to be called the Badger State. It wasn't so much that they were only they weren't exactly digging into a hole. I mean,
No.
There was a little bit of that, but there were also these badger huts, which were not too bad, and they've been standing for 200 years now.
I was going to say, they're right around the size of some of the one-bedrooms you'll find on campus at the UW schools.
That's what I'm saying. I mean, their footprint wasn't that much bigger than some of the log cabins that were in the area.
Let's go to Stan in De Pere, who's got a question for you, Tracey. Hi, Stan.
Yeah, hi. We understand today that lead can be a possibly dangerous element, and I'm wondering if the early miners and the Native Americans were afflicted with lead poisoning and what that looked like.
Ooh.
Right. That's a good question. Yes, all mining, all extractive economies cause ecological damage and hurt animals, plants, and people. They do. So the problem with the mining, of course, is you're not just bringing up lead ore, you're also bringing up cadmium, and you're bringing up all kinds of arsenic. You're bringing up toxic metals because that's what's in the deeper ground, right? Not maybe on our surface ground very much, but in the deeper ground. So you are bringing up things. The smelting process itself in the 1800s, basically that process was you had a furnace and you were using a blast furnace. You're getting that furnace to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit at least. That's going to release the sulfur dioxide and the nitrogen oxide molecules, and those get reactive with oxygen and water vapors once they're in the atmosphere up through the chimney. That creates sulfuric acid, nitric acid. That's called acid rain. That harms the soil. It creates a very acidic soil. It harms the plants, the animals. The lead itself, like if you were just touching lead, or like we have these at our museums in the area, and they let children and other people touch the lead ore in its sort of state of being in the matrix of the limestone. That's not very dangerous. I mean, you probably wouldn't want to lick your hand afterwards, right? But it's really when the lead is being crushed and when it's being processed and all that dust and stuff comes up into your lungs. Now you're getting lead poisoning into your lungs, and it made people irritable. It made them slower and dopey over time. You know, it definitely had a bad effect, yes.
Thank you for the call, Stan. Tracey, what happened to the lead mines of the Driftless region? Did we just run out of lead? What was the inevitable outcome?
We ran out of the easy lead, I'd say that. Most people will say that there's still a lot of lead under the ground, but it's not economically feasible to take it out. Same with zinc. Other countries are taking their lead out much cheaper, and these are international commodities. These aren't just local things that we need in our country. Lead right now is mostly used in car batteries. We've tried to get it as much out of the environment as you know. It's not in our gasoline or our paint anymore, thank goodness. But, you know, we are using it for batteries and other things, and it's used, you know, internationally. So it went away because of economics. It didn't pay to do it. Also, the easy ore was taken, so it gets more expensive when you have to go deeper underground, and now you've got a water table problem. So how are you going to get the water out? Well, now you need a steam engine, and then you need all kinds of other equipment to get it out. So it's no longer an easy two-man process with, you know, a windlass and a bucket and picking a gad, which is all you needed in the early days.
So when did that lead mining industry slow down or close?
By 1865, it was definitely slowed down. There was a peak during the Civil War, but then, you know, right after that war, you know, lead's used for making shot bullets. You know, lead ore was used for joining and seaming metal to stone or metal to metal. So when the Spanish actually, it's an international commodity, they started being able to produce it more cheaply, and ours wasn't as easy to get to. So it's kind of a lull in mining, and everybody went to farming if they hadn't already done that. And then our zinc mining started building up. Zinc is often found with lead ore. So the zinc is usually deeper, though. So it takes more equipment, more expensive equipment, and much more processing, very complicated processing methods to get the zinc. You know, we use zinc for like galvanizing, right? For iron, steel. It prevents rust, and it was used to make white paint, you know, like zinc oxide. So, you know, these industries died for an economic reason, and then by 1979, we finally have an EPA saying, you are, you know, adding a lot of toxins to the environment. We need to clean this up. And we do have a couple of Superfund sites that are related to mining in our area.
So the zinc mining followed the lead mining in the Driftless region. Were there folks who made millions off this? Were there mining magnates from this area?
Well, mostly, you know, by the time 1860s comes around, if you look at like plat maps, most of the land by that time was owned, the lead mining land and later zinc mining land was owned by large corporate interests. It wasn't like a couple of guys with a mining lease anymore. My family came here in 1834 as lead miners. So I got really interested in this topic, you know, as a historian because I had a personal connection to the lead mine district and to this industry. So I got much more interested than I might have been. But I think that the mining was the thing that made the boom of this part of Wisconsin. And we were the most populated area of Wisconsin when Wisconsin became a state. The population was really down here. And, of course, over by Green Bay in the east. But, the rest of the state wasn't that well populated yet.
And I'd imagine part of that has to do with river travel, lake travel up in Green Bay, and the ability to get around before we had roads. But I also wonder, where can I find these badger dens today? If I wanted to go see these, and are they protected lands?
So all of them are on private land.
Oh.
But I don't know if this is okay to tell you that I'm giving a tour of Native American Lead Mine District.
Yes.
On Sunday, September 27th. And we're going to start from Galena at 9:45. We're going to get on an air-conditioned bus. There's room for 40 people, and I still have seats. And I'm doing this with the Galena Joe Davis County Historical Society. So if people want to go to galenahistory.org, they can find the bus tour and join us. We're going to go by a badger hut, besides seeing a whole bunch of other sites related to Native Americans, the mining culture, and the actual mining industry in the area. So it should be a fun tour. It's a 5-hour tour.
Sunday, September 27th through the Galena Historical Society, online at galenahistory.org?
That's correct.
I like that you threw AC in there, Tracy. That is always...
I know. After this summer, who knows? September could be hot again.
Exactly. Tracey Lee Roberts,
yeah.
What are you still curious about in this story of Wisconsin's history? What are you still researching and looking to find out more?
Well, I had to learn about the lead mining industry itself so that I could talk about it as the basis, but I'm actually more a social historian. I'm really interested in the abolitionists that were here. I'm really interested in cultural history and the ethnic groups that came. My family came from northern England. That's a lead mining district. They came with unbelievable skills. They were already miners in England. And we talk about these Cornish miners. They were already highly skilled miners. So they're not just the southern guy showing up for 3 months as a sucker and then going back down, and just using a pick and a gad. These guys had some different kinds of skills that were more technologically advanced. So by the 1840s, we're getting these immigrant miners who really know what they're doing.
And then do we still see legacies of that today? Are there still institutions or organizations? Is there still a place where we will find this history existing now?
I'd say in every single town in the lead mine district, we're seeing the evidence of the early ethnic groups that came here. We have their churches, we have their buildings, we have their institutions, their cultural institutions. The Primitive Methodist Church is a really important British institution that came here from England and really made a big splash in this area. It's one of the biggest rural church groups in the area. It's very small now, but still mighty. And, Catholic churches, Father Mazzucchelli, one of our great leaders in this area, came from Italy, and he was an early 1830s Catholic priest here that made a huge difference. He was also an architect. He built buildings. He's created institutions, girls' schools, so that girls could learn science in the 1850s. So we have these folks who just helped us create communities, and the Irish tended to stick together. So we've got Irish old communities. We've got, old British communities. They're still called places like Irish Hollow, British Hollow. These places exist in our area.
Tracey Lee Roberts, I find that fascinating. Of all the fascinating things you've shared here this half hour, looking at what we see in the Driftless today and being able to see all the way back in time to our mining history, fascinating, and I thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Sure, it was fun. Thank you so much.
Again, that tour with Tracey Lee Roberts is Sunday, September 27th through the Galena Historical Society. Tracey Lee Roberts is a senior lecturer emeritus from the Department of History at UW-Platteville. I'm Lee Rayburn, and you're listening to WPR News. The solution to any problem, work, money, whatever, is to go fishing. And the worse the problem, the longer the time should be. That's from the website of Wisconsin Clearwater's chapter of Trout Unlimited, online at wcwtu.org. And joining us next on The Lee Rayburn Show is the president, Peter Jonas. And if you've got questions about trout fishing or trout streams, I want to invite you to join our conversation this half hour at 1-800-642-1234. That's 800-642-1234, or send an email to talk@wpr.org. And Peter Jonas, welcome back.
Well, thank you very much, Lee. I'm happy to be here.
So give us a little bit of an update. It is August, and how is our trout, and how are our trout streams?
For me, this is the most wonderful time of year to fish for trout because it is grasshopper season.
Okay, make that connection for me, Peter, please.
Well, trout feed quite heavily on all types of terrestrial insects, ants, beetles, but grasshoppers are the creme de la creme because they are a big bite, a lot of calories compared to the other insects that might find their way into a trout stream. So you can use larger flies, which for me as an angler of a certain age is a nice thing, be able to see the fly easily. The other thing is that trout will really move for them.
Really?
Yes. Sometimes if you're using a smaller insect, you have got to put it right in their feeding lane. But for grasshoppers, you can be a little sloppy. Sometimes actually being a little sloppy with your casting is an advantage because if the fly goes splat on the water, that is a key to the trout. So it's a great way for beginners to fish.
Thank you for that. I have never been fly fishing before. It's always been a rod and reel, and I'm always a little reluctant to think of whether or not I could actually make a cast with fly fishing. How much work does it take to get off the ground?
I feel the best way to start learning how to fly cast is to fly cast on your lawn 5 or 6 times, seriously. And of course, you're going to attract comments from your neighbors, how's the fishing and all of this kind of, which is just an added bonus. But it takes away the whole, the water's moving, there are obstacles, everything else. And
takes the pressure out of it because know you're not going to catch anything on the front lawn.
Exactly. So you throw a baseball cap on the ground about 15, 20 feet away and just keep trying to hit the thing with the end of your fly line. And, you can watch a number of YouTube videos for the basic technique of how to do that, and that's useful. But to do it about 10, 15 minutes a day for a week, so if you try to do it for an hour, you're gonna bust the fly rod over your knee, and fly rods are expensive. You don't want to do that. And so, 10, 15 minutes, put it away, take it up the next day, and before long, you'll be casting.
Well, how long does grasshopper season last here, Peter? Because it seems like that window might be closing.
The funny thing about the last few seasons, and I think it is a bizarre, I hate to call it a benefit, but almost a bizarre benefit of global warming, which, of course, is not a good thing. Don't want anybody thinking I think it's a good thing. But grasshopper season has just kind of gone on forever the last few years.
Oh, wow.
It has. Our trout season ends October 15th. And really, I've fished hoppers right up till almost that last week of the season, definitely through September and into the first week of October. So there's some time yet. I should mention one of the things about fishing in high summer that is very important is to carry a stream thermometer because trout are very susceptible to high water temperatures. They're threatened by those. If water temperature is above 65 degrees, you really should quit fishing where you're fishing.
Above 65?
Mm-hmm.
So these are cold water.
Correct. trout are a cold water indicator species, and they don't handle high water temperatures well. They can get very stressed.
That's tough. It might be great for grasshopper season. It might be rough for the trout.
Well, you got to find the right balance of, part of it is knowing what streams run colder that maybe have better thermal resiliency.
Sure.
Part of our brook trout reserves that the DNR is designated, one thing about those streams is that almost all of those streams are thermally resilient. That's one of the reasons why they're brook trout reserves, because brook trout require the coldest water of any of the trout we have in Wisconsin. But I just carry a cheap food thermometer, meat thermometer, because they make thermometers that are specifically for anglers, but generally you got to let them sit in the water for a while. I've got no patience, so I have an instant read thermometer.
I thought it was about being cheaper.
Yeah, well, that too. No money and no patience, Lee.
Peter Jonas, our guest, and we are trout fishing today. He is the president of Wisconsin Clearwater's chapter of Trout Unlimited, serving northwest Wisconsin counties, and you can join us at 1-800-642-1234 or talk at WPR.org. And let's go to Porter in Sun Prairie. Hi, Porter.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for taking my call.
Yeah, what do you have for us?
So I mostly trout fish in the winter in Lake Michigan, but in the summer I get my fix for trout fishing for them in the creeks, inland Wisconsin. I don't fly fish. I do spinning gear, but I noticed this year in the trout regulation book that I pick up every year, and I look at the map, and they have it color coded as to what streams or creeks are, classified as class 1, 2, and 3. And I noticed if you compare the two maps from last year and this year, there is a whole heck a lot of green and yellow and very little red, meaning that there's hardly any class 1 streams anymore. Is there any reason why the DNR kind of demoted a lot of these streams to a class 2 or 3 as opposed to a 1?
Can I ask what area of the country or what area of the state you live in?
Yes, I live south central Wisconsin. I'm Madison area, so
Okay.
I fish a lot of Dane County, Columbia County, and Grant County.
Okay. The stream classification, and I'm not a DNR employee or a spokesperson for the DNR. I do try to keep up on a little bit of this stuff, but just disclaimer there. But their stream classification system is by what they try to make objective standards. So a class 1 stream means that stream supports natural reproduction of wild populations of trout. So that is kind of the bottom line. A class 2 stream may have some natural reproduction, but generally is considered where it might need a little stocking to enhance its fishery. And a class 3 stream is simply a put and take type of fishery where it can only support stocked fish, and it might not even support those fish through the whole season. So not knowing exactly what streams you're talking about, and I wouldn't recommend naming your secret spots over statewide radio broadcast.
That's going to be my next question for you, Peter.
It's hard to say. I do know that, streams in the Dane County area are obviously going through a period where there's a great deal of development and intensive land use, and so that may be affecting how they are classifying some of these streams.
With less class 1 streams, does that suggest perhaps warmer waters than these fish can handle?
The class system is based not only on water temperature, but also, say, the quality of the substrate. So if it's primarily a heavily silted substrate where fish have difficulty reproducing, that might be a prime class 2 stream where it can support an adult population of trout, but it may not support a lot of natural reproduction. And of course, water purity and so on and so
quality,
forth.
temperature,
Yep,
substrate.
all of those
there are a
things.
lot of things to consider, but it is a interesting observation, Porter, and I'd be interested to see where the DNR moves from this year to next year, considering where it moved in the last year. So thank you for sharing. Thank you for calling. Let's go to Josh in Green Bay next. Hi, Josh.
Hey, thanks for taking my call. So a couple years ago, a parasite known to cause whirling disease in trout was found in Elton Creek at Silver Moon Springs Trout Farm. And that was because they were allowed to reroute all the water in Elton Creek into their ponds and then back out. And then the guy who won for the Republican governor last night was the guy who gave him a law to do that. Are there any other infestations of whirling disease in the state of Wisconsin other than the tributary waters of the Wolf River?
Josh, thank you. Whirling disease?
I have not heard anything about whirling disease, Josh, but one thing I do want to mention in regards to infestation of exotic species is that New Zealand mud snails were recently found in the Seas branch of Kickapoo Creek. And Seas branch I've fished that stream myself. It is a beautiful native brook trout stream. Absolutely gorgeous, runs into the west branch of the Kickapoo. New Zealand mud snails are a big problem because they really feast upon the very tiny micro life of the stream, the very bottom of the food chain, and they are basically undigestible by trout. So they are taking, if you will, food out of the food chain, and they're not passing it along to things that are bigger than themselves. So this has been a alarming development. And I see Lee has a bit of a puzzled look on his face about how New Zealand mud snails may have arrived.
It's a long ways away, Peter.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I'm afraid this one is probably on us anglers because New Zealand is a destination site for folks who can fish for trophy brown trout. There are incredible trout fishing opportunities in New Zealand and people who have the capacity to fish internationally. And I think it is a testament to how popular the driftless region has become, that people who fish all around the world fish in the driftless. And it probably, I mean, I'm only speculating at this point, but it's likely that they arrived in some sediment that was on the bottom of somebody's wading boots. That's a likely cause in this scenario. It underscores the importance of thoroughly cleaning your wading boots and your waders after you've been fishing somewhere where there are probably anywhere, frankly, but particularly if you fish somewhere where there have been forms of life that we're trying not to pass on, exotic species, this sort of thing. So, yeah, that certainly is a big issue. Whirling disease that is first sprung up out west on the Madison River has come to our area through the situation Josh mentioned, and now we're dealing with New Zealand mud snail, so we've got some issues here.
I got to tell you, I did not know that our trout were so. It feels like they're coming at you from just about every angle, from the environment to the invasive species to the disease. You feel like I'm worried about our trout, Peter.
Good. Glad because, well, I'll tell you, before I get into some of the details of this must be the bad news section of the show at the moment here. But, you know, I'm a firm believer that people come to care about the environment and advocate for the environment and change their behavior more out of love than out of guilt.
Yeah.
I mean, guilt can motivate, but when someone falls in love, whether it is fishing for trout or whether it is rock climbing or following butterflies, whatever it takes, that I like to think is a portal to start to see larger and larger concentric circles of connections and to really make an environmentalist. And of course, this is the Wisconsin idea, really, with Aldo Leopold. You think about how he integrated his own personal experience as a hunter and an angler with his scientific research. And so I'm glad you're concerned about our trout, because they are worthy of our concern, and
there's reason to be concerned.
Yes, absolutely.
Here's another one that came up on our show about a week ago, and I did not think this would be a contentious issue, but Jeff in Bayfield's on the line, and he's going to lay it out for us. Jeff, hi. Jeff, are you there?
Yeah, thanks for the show. About 3 or 4 years ago, I attended a beaver trout one-day conference in Hayward, Wisconsin, and I wonder if our guests could update me and our listeners on the latest scientific data on trout versus beaver. I know Wisconsin DNR is currently updating the beaver management plan, a 10-year plan, and just wonder if you had any new information on the beaver trout controversy.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks for throwing me that question that I'm certain is going to get me into hot water with somebody. So
there's no right answer here, Peter. But we talked about this about a week ago.
Yes.
And there is varying opinions on this, and there is, the question about how to coexist. You talk about the interconnectedness and how important that is and how there's a balance in nature and whether or not we are reinforcing that balance or putting that balance out of whack, and how we can respect the populations of both wild species in a way that defends their habitat as well as their existence.
Exactly. And I do want to direct your attention, Jeff, to if you go to the Wisconsin Public Radio site, to Lee's site, there is the interview of a couple fellows, I forget their name, that are definitely in the beaver believer camp, and they presented very well, I felt, their position on all of the advantages that beavers can bring to an ecosystem. For myself, I don't share the some trout anglers absolutely just loathe beavers. and I
learned that last week.
Yeah. I consider myself neither a beaver believer nor a believer hater. I consider myself beaver curious, that I think there are lots of different ways that trout interact with beavers, and beavers interact with a watershed that we don't fully understand. I will say there is a scientist, Matt Mitro, at the Wisconsin DNR, who has done some outstanding research. One of the things that Matt has done in his recent search of Elk Creek in the Driftless is that, at least in that setting, in an agricultural setting, beaver dams were a very real impediment to fish passage. And I think sometimes some of the research that comes from what we'll call the beaver believer end of things is often done on western trout streams, which are very different geographically than our Midwestern streams that are often in an agricultural environment or in a North Woods environment. I think something that would be helpful to kind of turn down the adversarial rhetoric and arrive at more constructive solutions is I would love to see us really focus on individual cases, like an individual watershed, and do some hard research about how beavers might affect it. I do point people to Matt Mitro's work. I think it is. I think your guest last week, they're not here to defend themselves. I think they were a bit tough on the DNR, because I think the DNR has really done some serious research on this subject that, if it hasn't been peer-reviewed, would certainly pass peer review muster. So that's my thought about that. Finally, just a personal note. I fished some streams with a lot of beavers in them, which I don't mind, but I do wish they had more social awareness because their eyesight is terrible. And I've had a couple instances where they've just like swam right up to me and then wheeled a 360 and... My old heart's getting a little...
I was going to say, maybe they knew exactly what they were doing, Peter.
My old heart is getting a little fragile for that kind of scenario. And or if you get a tail slap when you don't know they're there, it is unnerving. But
Jeff, I'm glad you called, and I'm glad you asked, and that was a wonderful answer, Peter. So thank you for that, and personal too. So let's go to Tu Yang next in Madison. Tu Yang, hi.
Hello. Thanks for taking my call. When I think of trout fishing, especially growing up, I imagine the fly rod and the dry fly. But growing up, I realized that there's more than one way to fish for trout. In particular, using a spinning rod and reel. And I'm wondering if your guest can talk more about the different methods that fishermen and fisherwomen can use to catch trout.
Thanks a lot for that question. I am happy to do that. One of the things I think that Trout Unlimited could do a better job at is to really reinforce the idea that we are not a fly fishing organization. That's a lot of our ethos, and a lot of our members do, in fact, fly fish. But Trout Unlimited is intentionally not a fly fishing organization. And I think we have really burned or damaged bridges that we shouldn't burn or damage by people getting into conflicts about one method of fishing is better. I'm personally for whatever method of fishing gets you outside and gets you...
Just fishing is best.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. Fish. It solves a multitude of... My grandmother used to say she never met a bad boy who fished. I sort of feel that in my own personal experience, I've seen that disproven at times.
Yes, but the point is well taken.
Yeah, exactly. So you can do that. So, for example, even in grasshopper season, while I do think a fly rod is quite advantageous in that circumstance, you can, with a casting bubble, put a fly on a spinning rod, and you've got enough weight to cast it out there, and that is one way you can fish for trout. Another, people are I see people very effectively using spinners of various sizes for trout. I think some methods are starting to come together. For example, there are people who their passion is kind of headhunting, fishing for very large trout in some of our downstream areas. With a spinning rod, they might fish with a very large rapala. And now we have fly anglers who are fishing streamer flies that are like the size of a large rapala with a little heavier fly rod. And it's a very interesting, the methods are not that dissimilar from each other. So
interesting.
Yeah, so we have some ways of doing that. In the steelhead and brown trout, the fish that run out of Lake Michigan and Lake Superior, there's a form of fishing called centerpin, which actually I have dabbled in a little bit myself, that you fish with a reel that sort of looks like a fly rod reel, very long rod. You cast a float, and the thing that attracted me was I was out on the Brule one day watching someone with one of these centerpin rods, and I had drift envy. The person could make a drag-free drift that was so long. It was like a good 150 yards. And, I'm getting like 15 yards adrift on my fly rod, and I thought, this is killing me.
I got to try this. Peter, we are out of time, but we have so much more to talk about.
We're out of time.
Look at that. That went by so quick, as fishing often does. Sir, I invite you back anytime. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Very much.
Peter Jonas is president of the Wisconsin Clearwaters chapter of Trout Unlimited, serving the counties of Northwest Wisconsin. I'm Lee Rayburn, and you're listening to WPR News.